This talk is about climate change, it's about the climate emergency, and it's about economic growth. And that's something that we're going to hear a lot about over the kind of coming months as governments really attempt to plan their COVID-19 exit strategies. And I think that there's a kind of opportunity to have a very critical conversation about what kind of growth we should be trying to insert back into society after what's going to be quite a profound economic contraction. My hope in this talk is to draw some parallels between how we could rethink architecture and how we could rethink tourism. So I'm afraid I am going to talk a bit about buildings and materials and that kind of thing, but hopefully by the end it will have formed a kind of loose manifesto for not only how we might reconceptualize the way that we make buildings, but also how we might do holidays in the future. But first, a little time travel. I can't play an audio clip through my computer because it's too old, but hopefully Jakob is going to share his audio. Is that going to happen?
Yes.
So we're going to play you a 2-minute audio clip. And while that plays, I'd like you to kind of close your eyes and listen to the voices in the clip and ask yourself, as you hear these voices, just question the statements they're making and ask yourself where you think the truth lies. So I think I stop sharing and then Jakob shares the audio.
But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth, forget the social services that we have. And what a policy!
There are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
Los movimientos sociales son antiimperialistas, anticapitalistas, antineoliberales.
There are physical limits to growth. If we continue to ignore them and instead base our short-term policies on the assumption of continued growth, we'll overshoot those limits and collapse.
You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular.
Since when was GDP a sensible measure of human welfare? And yet everything that governments want to do is to try to boost GDP.
Nothing in nature grows forever. We urgently need financial, political, and social innovations that enable us to overcome this structural dependency on growth.
We've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism.
Today, Mr. Speaker, this House must declare an environment and climate emergency. We have no time to waste.
There are no limits to growth. There are no limits when men and women are free to follow their dreams. No limits. No limits when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
Okay. Audio didn't quite work as I was hoping, but hopefully you managed to pick up most of that. That was sort of 40 years of political and economic debate condensed into about 2 minutes. And this is kind of where the curtain opens on the talk I want to do. On a society that kind of understands that we're in a climate emergency, knows it needs to do something quite radical about that, but is still very much enthralled to the idea articulated by Ronald Reagan at the end of that clip, that there are no limits on growth, on culture, on the economy, on movement, and even on architecture. And so the title of this mini talk is One-Way Ticket to Infinity and Back, which is, for the kind of culture vultures among you, a reference to The Darkness's single One-Way Ticket to Hell and Back. The Darkness is a British glam metal band, and their song is about a bad trip, a bad cocaine trip. And it's also a reference to the catchphrase of Buzz Lightyear, the toy space ranger voiced by Tim Allen in Pixar's Toy Story series. And both The Darkness and Buzz Lightyear's catchphrase speak of taking trips with an apparently seductive aspiration but which ultimately prove unattainable. Using cocaine is expensive, unethical, and can go horribly wrong, while Buzz is not the galaxy-hopping superhero that he hopes, but in fact a child's plaything, unable to come close, let alone beyond infinity. And yet these two aspirations speak of something that, something about kind of the popular dreams of contemporary society, that desire to go beyond our limits, to break past boundaries, whether those are spatial, cognitive, or in power. And I think our resistance to limits, or our uncomfortableness with limits, is now a kind of almost foundational myth of modern society. Reagan's quote, "There are no limits to growth and human progress," was not just an offhand remark, it was part of his inaugural address when he was re-elected in 1985. So it was, absolutely central to the political project of neoliberalism. He was, of course, also lying. Only a decade earlier, the Club of Rome, which we also heard, had warned that if physical limits to growth are ignored, society will overshoot those limits and collapse, or the economy will overshoot those limits and collapse. But today, overcoming limits is still a very celebrated kind of aspiration. I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of cheesy fridge magnets with motivational slogans like "You are your only limit" or "No limits." And even as unprecedented fires, floods, biodiversity loss, and now a pandemic most likely spread to humans through pushing nature too hard, all scream with a single voice of a planetary boundary that is at its breaking point. Our relationship with limits remains antagonistic. So we see this this antagonism in all sorts of ways. We see it in the quasi-rural landscape of green belts, which are kind of weird, uncomfortable limits on the edge of cities, embodying a paradox of a society that is both sick from and addicted to its own sprawl. Green belts are sort of neither green nor are they effective boundaries on development. They're a sort of a disappointing bodge, if you like. We see it in tourism, where journeys our grandparents couldn't imagine are available at prices our parents couldn't imagine, and are more common for many even than eating seasonal vegetables. And we see it in architecture, where despite widespread knowledge of the climate emergency, and actually a lot of kind of sincere care for the climate, nonetheless, as a sector, buildings account for about 40% of global carbon emissions. And most of all, we see this antagonism with limits in the promise that economic growth, despite our finite planet, can and should continue forever. This year, of course, the economy will shrink, and the question of how and whether we try to grow it again, for me, is the central question when defining the terms of the COVID-19 recovery, and hopefully a question which can be useful in how we rethink this question of tourism for a planet in crisis. So let's just dig into architecture a little bit. This is how that 40% of global carbon emissions breaks down. You have the green chunk, which is the embodied carbon of making new buildings. So that's the carbon emitted constructing architecture. We have the red chunk, which is the operational carbon. So that's all the energy that goes into heating and cooling and lighting existing buildings. And then the beige chunk, which is plug loads. So that's just the electricity that goes into appliances, like the laptop that you're probably using to watch this. And at the moment, we tend to focus on this bit. That's the operational carbon of new buildings. So every time a government makes a regulation saying, if you're building a new building, you need to have better thermal efficiency, they're focusing on that little chunk. But of course, what this graph kind of screams is that we really need to be focusing more on embodied carbon and operational carbon of existing buildings. Now, operational carbon of existing buildings is fairly straightforward. It's ambitious politically, but it means massive retrofitting projects such as this one, the Energiesprong scheme from the Netherlands. But embodied is slightly trickier because there are so many moments in the construction of a building where carbon is emitted. And if you want to kind of break down all the different parts of a building and the kind of carbon that is emitted in the construction of each bit, you get a very complicated picture. But it's a picture that we need to get into if we're serious about the climate emergency. So this is the kind of diagram that we're going to be seeing much more in the architecture sector, a diagram of the embodied carbon in all the different components and parts of a building. And what you can very clearly see from here is that a huge chunk of carbon is coming from the structure and the superstructure. That's because those things have a lot of mass, but it's also because they tend to use very high carbon materials like concrete and steel. And, you know, the sort of fairly simple conclusion that we can jump to quite quickly is that the architecture of the future may need to be made of very different materials, materials which will have a much lower carbon footprint and perhaps very different kind of structural performance. So materials like cob earth, like unfired bricks, like straw bales, like hempcrete. Now, many of these materials are weaker than concrete and certainly less highly performing than PIR insulation, but they're also much lower carbon. And what does this mean? And this has sort of implications for how we design as architects. What it probably means is rethinking our aesthetic preferences, falling out of love with the high carbon style of the international style here, modernism, but similar styles that rely on high performance, high carbon materials, and falling in love with stereotomics, pudgy walls, thick buildings, fat architecture. Now, there is a lineage here, and actually a lot of people find stereotomic architecture intensely seductive. What are the question of sort of what the atmospheric possibilities of low carbon architecture, which is made from thick, weak, low energy walls, I think is a fascinating question. We used to build a lot like this in the past, and there are practitioners now who are innovating quite rapidly. So this is Martin Rauch making a rammed earth vault. But the question is, why don't we build like this? You know, this is still very rare to have walls anywhere near this thick. Why don't we choose the stereotomic architecture of hyper low carbon, high thermal mass? Clearly we did in the past. So what has changed? And to answer that question, I want to dig into the story of an ordinary piece of stone. So this is a piece of limestone, has a compressive strength of about 100 newtons per millimeter squared. Pretty good bit of kit, nice bit of rock, lovely. But we don't use it like this. We process it, we quarry it, we grind it, we heat it, we sinter it, we quench it, we granulate it, we blend it. All of these processes taking a huge amount of energy. The temperatures, these are cement kilns. The temperature in those horizontal cylinders you're seeing is well over 1,000 degrees to make cement. And you end up with a material like this. Now, this is concrete. Now with a compressive strength of just 40 newtons per millimeter squared. So all that energy, all that effort to go into making a material that is weaker than the one we started out with. Why on earth are we doing this? Well, here is the thing, and here's where we kind of come back to economic growth. Concrete has a higher carbon footprint because there are more processes that go into making it. Now, from an economic point of view, that's a good thing. More processes mean more opportunities for trade. More opportunity for trade mean more economic activity. So if you live in a society that thinks that the most important thing is to grow the economy and everything else kind of comes secondary, then simple materials like stone at the top with a fairly straightforward process from quarry to building site are gradually disincentivized, while complex materials with high carbon footprints like concrete are gradually incentivized to the point they've built up a huge infrastructure, and it's very hard for the industry to wean itself off them at all. So growth does kind of weird things to what we design with as architects. And coming back to tourism a little, it does weird things to what we design as well. This is the original plan for Stansted Airport by Foster and Partners in the UK. And the idea was ingenious. They said, let's make flying by air a more calming experience. Let's bury all the baggage handling, and we'll create this big airy shed for the airport terminal that travelers can just kind of amble through, having a nice relaxing time. It'll be clear, it'll be logical, it'll be straightforward, it'll be soothing. This is what Stansted Airport's plan looks like now. They've changed it. They've put in this undulating linear mall of sort of Toblerone hell and Ray-Ban stands that sucks in passengers at one end and then spits them out at the other end. This is a kind of architecture which is entirely kind of designed around controlling where people move, and commerce, maximizing opportunities for economic exchange to take place and for economic growth. It is no coincidence that its plan resembles an intestinal tract, an organ which has evolved exclusively to suck the goodness out of everything that passes through it. So I guess I'm trying to problematize growth here, and I think that there's an important opportunity, or like an opportunity to draw a parallel between tourism, or a certain type of tourism, and a certain type of architecture. So the archetype of the individual holiday, I think, embodies some of the problems of conventional architecture, and we've already sort of discussed some of those today. Conceived as this kind of one-off extravagance with an intensive burst of high energy activity, let's say a kind of 2-week safari in Kenya or 2 weeks skiing in Switzerland, that is intended to counterweight a much longer period of not being on holiday, of being back in the normal world, of being back in your humdrum, apartment, going to work as normal. But stepping back from this particular idea of what a holiday could be, to maybe a more kind of everyday conception of holidays, of cultural festivals that take place throughout the year, recurring feasts, rituals, changes in social dynamics. Perhaps that is a more promising focus for what the future of a better kind of tourism or a better kind of architecture could be. So I'm talking about things like May Day, about the Durham Miners Gala, about even Open House Weekend, the crazy architecture festival that I now run. These long-standing cultural events which change our state as individuals, that connect us to people we don't normally meet, that alter the kind of composition of the community for a temporary period of time, transporting us, but with festivity, costume, location, and special food, rather than resorting to the kind of growth-based model of carbon-intensive trips abroad. And so what if the making of architecture was somehow analogous? What if making architecture was not a kind of one-off process that led to a final outcome, but a recurring ritual, something like prayer, something like ice cream, something like Christmas, these cultural holidays that do not finish, they constantly come back. You've never had the last Christmas, it will be around again. Small nourishing doses that happen regularly rather than these sort of huge monolithic projects. What might an architecture of ritual be like? And here's where materials come back into focus, because one of the things that makes it very hard to move away from concrete is that it's very tough, it's very hard wearing. It can go for a very long time without any maintenance. It is kind of the architectural equivalent of that holiday model of going on a big safari and then not having any time off for a long period afterwards. And then we, as people who are interested in sustainability, we hear that making a building out of resilient materials is inherently sustainable because it lasts for so long. It can last for 100 years perhaps. So it must be ecologically good because it kind of, sticks around. But actually, from an ecological point of view, this is a bad argument, because we don't have 100 years. It doesn't matter if making a robust material, making a building that will last for a long time, making a building that will last for a long time, but that comes with at the expense of a high blast of carbon emissions in its construction, is no longer a viable model, no matter how long that building is going to last. So longevity, hardwariness, solidity, all these kind of seductive values that we've invoked as architects with a lot of material strategies throughout the years might need to be rethought and abandoned entirely. An alternative could be an architecture which is actually not very tough at all, which requires constant maintenance, but which doesn't come with all that carbon in its construction. So what might an architecture of repair be like? And how would that be expressed? Well, let's take thatch. Thatch is a kind of amazing material. It's pretty much global, naturally abundant. It sequesters some carbon. It has these amazing sculptural qualities. The reason we don't use thatch very much is because it has high maintenance requirements. So a roof like this might need to be replaced every 10 to 15 years. But from an ecological point of view, it is better to replace a thatch roof every year than it is to build it once out of concrete. So what might it mean to embrace kind of material strategies in architecture, not despite their need for constant repair, but because of them? And what kinds of festivals or holidays could you imagine building up around a kind of ritualized form of architectural repair? Well, here's an interesting example from Mali. This is the Great Mosque of Djenné. Its facade is covered with these bundles of rods called torren. Now these posts are kind of, they're decorative. They have a role enlivening the facade, but they're also the scaffolding that allows the building to be repaired, which is every year in a kind of ceremony following heavy rains. Now, that's a very kind of traditional example, but I guess the role of the torren as something that is both a thing which expresses repair and which enables repair is a kind of rich theme that maybe we could explore in contemporary architecture as well. And maybe it's not so hard to imagine what that might be like if you consider the lengths that the high-tech architects went to achieve some of their aesthetics. So this is the Lloyd's building by Richard Rogers. And these blue cranes on the roof are cleaning infrastructure. They're window cleaning cranes that lower people down to clean the glass every now and then. But they are also architectural form, right? They're also part of the story that Richard Rogers is telling you about the future of modernism and this kind of machiney, mechanistic aesthetic that he's developing. So this is cleaning as architecture. Is it so hard to imagine what maintenance as architecture could be like as well? Now, so far we've just looked at, I guess, sort of the repair of buildings as a metaphor for ritual. But what if we were to take that argument just one step further, which I'm going to do in the sort of final chunk of this? Could we imagine forms of architecture which are not just maintaining buildings as a form of festivity or as a kind of recurring ritual, but actually are forms of festivity? Is there such a thing as architecture as festival? Well, this is a giant trumpet. What on earth is it doing here in this field? What purpose does it serve? It's called a here. It was made by the architecture practice Studio Weave, the grounds of Kendleston Hall in England. And its purpose is to open up auditory vistas to the landscape. So like a kind of viewing platform for sound rather than sight. It's essentially a tool to enable people to simply take in their surroundings, to stand somewhere beautiful, to do very little, and to absorb the natural world around them through sound. In other words, it's a kind of architectural justification to break out of a way of operating that requires a purpose to justify how you use your energy. It is an excuse to do very little. It is a dépense machine. And this term dépense is kind of a key one that keeps coming back in degrowth theory. And it's maybe an interesting one to think about in terms of reconceptualizing the holiday or architecture. It comes from a French artist and philosopher called Georges Bataille, and it means the expending of surplus human energy on acts which are unproductive in an economic or servile sense, but could be culturally rich. So things like mourning if someone's died, many hobbies, prayer, meditation, play, spectacles, the arts, romance, and certainly sexual pleasure, things which we do not because they are good investments, not because we're going to get some sort of profit from them in the future, but because they are culturally rich and because we feel better by doing them. You could think of dépense as simply acts which are purely cultural without an external goal to justify themselves. Dépense could be as simple as taking the scenic route home rather than the most direct route home. I think tattoos are an interesting example of dépense, because if you think about a tattoo, once you've bought it, it's lost all its economic value. There is no second-hand market for tattoos. It doesn't matter how famous the tattoo artist who did your tattoo was, you're never going to be able to sell it for a profit. They are in no way a financial investment. And in that sense, they're quite different to a lot of forms of art which retain value and can even be traded as a kind of commodity class. And I kind of wonder what would it mean for architecture to be something similar, to be a bit more like tattoos, something that doesn't have to justify itself on economic terms to have cultural value. And I feel like there are some examples of this that we can find in folk architecture. So this, of course, is a maypole. Maypoles, find them all over the world, well, sorry, all over Europe, particularly in Austria and in the UK. Austrian ones tend to be much bigger, but British ones are kind of cute in their own way and have these ribbons on them. And if you dance around maypole in a particular way, you can form these very complex weaving patterns. Is there something about, and you know, these are structures that are made without an economic goal in mind. They're also not, you know, they're not serving a particularly practical purpose. It's not like these help with kind of farming or anything. They're a purely cultural opportunity. Maybe a more contemporary example is the Wind House, which was a project in the Oslo Triennale. It's made by Architecture Uncomfortable Workshop, who are Hungarian architects. And they were sort of essentially frustrated that a kind of consumerism felt like it was taking away an appreciation of the changing of the seasons in Hungary. So they got together and every year for the past few years have made a wind house as a kind of little collective exercise between a few families. And they carry it up onto a hill and they build it to sort of mark the arrival of spring. You know, this is a very small project, but this is a structure, this is a piece of cultural architecture which has no external goal. It is the making of the small building which is the reward in itself. And maybe a more kind of extreme example of that is the Shinnekin Sengu ceremony in Japan, where for every 20 years for centuries, the people of my prefecture have demolished and rebuilt the Isha shrine, not to expand it, not to redevelop it or grow it or change it in any way, but because the building of the shrine, the bringing of the wood to the site and the erection of this building is a festival. This is, I think, an amazing example where the kind of Venn diagram of architecture and festivity is just a perfect circle. And the final structure that I want to kind of share with you is another example of dépense. And it's the simplest one of all, the cairn. So a cairn is a collectively built piece of wayfinding infrastructure, a simple but recognizable column of rocks made and maintained organically by travelers to help each other find routes in remote places. If you're the kind of tourist who likes walking holidays, then you'll be very familiar with cairns. The idea is As you pass the cairn, you pick up a rock and you place it on the pile, meaning the structure is constantly maintained in equilibrium, constantly repaired by strangers on behalf of other strangers. And what's fascinating about cairns is that no money changes hands. No one has commissioned the cairn. No one even owns the cairn. There is no map saying where the cairn should be placed. These things emerge organically and then are maintained organically by many hands on behalf of each other. And yet, from nothing, these small architectural elements have emerged. You can't own a cairn, you can't sell a cairn. Economically, they have no value at all. But if you are lost on the mountain in the fog, you can make out the shape of a cairn in the gloom. It can help you to find the path back down to safety. So something that has no economic value at all can in fact save your life. And what could be more valuable than that? And I'm going to end there, I think, if that's okay. Thank you very much.